What's up guys, welcome back. This is Anime Crossover. You'll be watching What If Naruto Was Mugetsu Part 5. Now, let's begin. The basement of the Shiba estate smelled of sweat, ozone, and burnt sulfur. For the past 5 hours, Ichigo Kurosaki's hands hadn't left the smooth, heavy glass in the spirit core. His knees were stuffed from the cold stone floor, his shoulders burning from a deep, agonizing lactic acid buildup. You're doing great, Kurosaki. Uryu Ishida ground out, teeth clenched tight. The Quincy knelt right across from Ichigo, his pale hands glowing with a pristine, highly structured blue light. Get your output back. You're going to break the structural integrity. I'm bringing it back. Ichigo snapped back, sweat dripping from his brow. Ishida, your energy is too stiff. You're trying to build a box in a sphere. The glass orb was a chaotic, volatile mess between them. The pale blue, spinning vortex that Ichigo had successfully contained earlier was now violently clashing with 3 different fourth frequencies. Uryu's Quincy Reishi was cold and mathematical, trying to exert forceful domination over the ambient particles. Orihime Inoki's energy was warm and bright and fiercely defensive, cushioning and accidentally choking the rotation. The red power in Yasutori Sato was heavy and dull, pulsing in the dark, primal beat that felt dangerously close to the surrounding hollow Reishi of Hueco Muna. The glass orb trembled violently, emitting a high-pitched, terrifying screech as the conflicting energies ground against each other. Focus. Kukaku Shiba barked, pacing around the group with one arm crossed over her chest. The cherry of her pipe glowed bright in the dark silence. You're not trying to win an argument. You are trying to create one integrated shell. Don't mix the frequencies. You will be vaporized by the Shakomaku the moment you touch it. Ichigo closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling. He could feel the wild, terrifying power building beneath his palms. His own Shinigami power, vast and dense and roaring, wanted to swallow the other 3 signatures whole. His Riryoku's natural response was to overpower, to defend. I need to match them, Ichigo thought. The absolute, undeniable need to keep his friends alive overriding any instinct to dominate the sphere. I can't be the wall. I've got to be the glue. Deep in the silent void of the inner mindscape, the cracked and dry ocean floor vibrated with the agonizing friction of the Reishi above. Naruto Uzumaki rested against the broken stone pillar, the heavy iron chains draped on his lap. The crippled god of the void could feel the jagged edges of the 4 conflicting souls trying to merge forcefully and chaotic. You're too loud, kid, Naruto projected, his inner voice a deep, rumbling resonance that cut through the spiritual static. You're trying to match their volume, but your lungs are too big. You will drown them. Naruto concentrated on the microscopic singularity in his chest. He didn't give Ichigo power. He did not project them, immutably present, into the material world. He just reached out and laid a heavy, conceptual hand over the roaring furnace of Ichigo's soul. He throttled the boy's output with a violent squeeze, compressing the vast, unruly ocean of Ichigo's Shinigami power into a narrow, steady, incredibly dense current. Don't try to lead the rotation, Naruto ordered the boy, steadying the boy's fraying nerves. Have Quincy build the building. Let the girl pad the walls. You just give the gravity. Keep them in the middle. Ichigo's breath caught suddenly in the underground silence. The frantic, choking desire to control the sphere faded away, replaced by the dense, motionless silence which came from the god in his chest. Ichigo stopped trying to push. He relaxed the tension in his shoulders, and the shrieking Reishi gave way to a low, terrifyingly dense hum. He stopped attacking Uryu's rigid structure and instead encased it in his pale blue energy, serving as the mortar to the Quincy bricks. Chad's red energy's heavy bluntness pushed down into the bottom of the sphere, making a solid immovable base. He felt the warmth of Orihime's golden light wrap around the outside, smoothing out the violent friction. The high-pitched screech of the glass orb was gone. The blinding, chaotic flashes of light fused into a single, humongous, perfectly stable sphere of glowing, swirling Reishi. It hummed with a perfect, unified frequency, shining forth into the dark silo in a radiant, pearlescent light. We got it. Chad's black eyes glimmered with the glow of the vortex. Uryu let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension leaving his stiff spine. Structural integrity is intact. The rotation is self-perpetuating. Not bad, Kukaku murmured, a real feral grin splitting her face. She drew a heavy pocket watch grabbing Zangetsu's heavy hilt wrapped in cloth. He slung the massive black cleaver onto his back. His allies he did not glance at. Time to stop making excuses. They were under the weight of the block of the executioner, the heavy, absolute reality. Climb in the tube. Kukaku pointed at the enormous vertical iron barrel that filled the center of the silo. The group walked to the base of the flower crane cannon. A heavy metal hatch was flung open and a circular grated platform hung over a bottomless guard shaft. Ichigo stepped onto the grating, his heavy black sword pulling at his shoulder. Ryu, Chad, and Orihime came up behind him, shoulder to shoulder in the tight space. Yoruichi leapt gracefully onto Ichigo's shoulder in her sleek black feline form, digging her claws slightly into the fabric of his shiokisho to keep herself steady. Show the spear. Yoruichi hissed, her golden eyes trained on the open hatch above them. Don't let the rotation drop for a microsecond. Ichigo extended his hand, his bandaged fingers ablaze. Uryu, Chad, and Orihime followed suit. The pearlescent, swirling vortex of unified reishi burst from their palms, rapidly expanding until the five of them were entirely enclosed within a glowing, perfect spherical barrier. Instantly the air inside the shell thickened, heavy under pressure, with a sharp smell of ozone. Kukaku was at the control console just outside the tube, her single hand flying over a bank of massive iron levers. Hold on to your teeth, Kukaku shrieked, her voice echoing down the iron barrel. She slapped her fist down on a huge red keto seal. The incantation flew from her lips, a fast, explosive chant that called for ambient reishi of the whole valley. The assembly of stars, the foundation of the heavens, a thunderweed, an iron carriage, pierced the sky and crushed the earth. The great iron hatch slammed down above them, leaving the launch tube in complete darkness save for the light of their own sphere. A thunderous, cataclysmic roar burst from beneath the grated platform. The flower crane went off. Boom. The physical G-force hit Ichigo like a falling mountain. His knees gave way, boots scrabbling on the metal mesh. The sheer, terrible speed sucked the air right out of his lungs. His vision blurred, the edges of sight blackened as the cannonball shot up the vertical barrel at supersonic speeds. They burst forth from the launch chute, out of the earth. Ichigo caught a dizzying, terrifying flash of the Rukongai slums blurring past them below, through the translucent, glowing shell of their reishi sphere. They were in the air, totally, streaking across the night sky like a falling star in reverse. The shield is coming. Ryu shouted over the deafening roar of the wind, his hands flat against the inside of the sphere, desperately trying to hold the structural geometry. The massive, pristine white circular walls of the Sailor Beam grew rapidly in their vision, miles ahead of them, but it wasn't the walls they were shooting at. A faint, translucent dome shimmered high into the bruised night sky, covering the entire fortress. The Shakonmaku. Hold on, Ichigo roared, forcing every bit of his compressed reishi into the outer edge of their shell. The cannonball hit the shield. The collision did not result in an explosion. It was a grinding, horrific friction, as of continental plates tearing against each other. The pearlescent sphere vibrated violently. The air inside superheated in an instant, tasting of burning copper and scorched earth. The Shakonmaku was working hard to vaporize the foreign reishi, battling the localized vortex they had generated. Push, Chad roared, his massive arms shaking violently as he poured his heavy, crimson energy into the base of the sphere, anchoring them against the sheer, repelling force of the Sailor's absolute defense. Shit. It's burning through, Orihime screamed as her golden defensive light flickered rapidly while the Shakonmaku devoured the outer layers of their shell. Ichigo bit his lip, blood oozing from where he'd bitten. He searched deep in his own center and found the heavy, immovable silence of the void. He took the absolute, primal need to get to Rukia and crushed it into the very fabric of the spinning reishi. The sphere blazed blindingly bright. The pearlescent cannonball shattered the surface tension of the Shakonmaku with a deafening, shattering crack. They cut straight through the shield and exploded into the airspace above the spotless white roofs of the court of pure souls. We did it, Uryu gasped, a rare, genuine smile of triumph crossing his face. But the victory was somewhat premature. Their cannonball's internal rotation was completely thrown into disarray by the violent friction of breaking through the highly compressed Seki-Seki barrier. The four different frequencies of reishi had spent their combined concentration to break through the wall, and now suddenly and localized shockwave, and the group was instantly separated. Ichigo was thrown violently back into the freezing night air. He fell, head over heels, with the wind in his ears. He saw a horrific, brief image of Uryu and Orihime being hurled miles away through a cluster of distant white spires. Chad was a black smear heading into another part of the sprawling fortress. The unity was shattered. They were all over the place. Ichigo spun through the air, his Shinigami senses taking over. He poured his dwindling reishi into his woven sandals, looking for a hold on the spiritual particles around him to stop his fall. He had not time enough. He punched out through the tiled roof of a huge, pristine white barracks building. The ceramic tiles shattered like brittle glass. The wooden rafters broke under the sheer kinetic force of his plunging body. Ichigo slammed into the polished wood floor of the interior courtyard with a bone-jarring thud. A huge cloud of white dust and pulverized wood billowed into the night air. He rolled 3 times, tearing his black shiakusho completely, then slammed heavily against a thick stone post. He lay there a moment, with his lungs desperately trying to suck in oxygen. All the muscles in his body protested, bruised and battered from the violent entry. Zangetsu's heavy black steel was still strapped to his back, a cold, unyielding comfort against his spine. He stood up, spitting out a mouthful of dust. He was by himself. The Seireizan courtyard was pristine, utterly unwelcoming, and silent to the point of suffocation. The heavy, silent emptiness in his chest pulsed with a slow, resonant warning. He was in the wall. Suddenly a sharp, piercing siren began to wail in the distance, echoing over the white rooftops, utterly shattering the quiet night. The alarms of the Goto 13 had been sounded. It was known, the invasion. Ichigo's brown eyes narrowed on the dark archways surrounding the courtyard, his hand gripping the cloth wrapped filled with his enormous cleaver. The hunt was on and he was the prey. The wailing of the Seireidi alarm system did not resemble a typical siren. A piercing, dissonant spiritual frequency vibrated directly against Ichigo Kurisaki's bone marrow. He stood in the center of the ruined courtyard, surrounded by shattered cedar rafters and broken ceramic tiles from the roof he had just fallen through. The night air was freezing, carrying the sharp, woody scent of pulverized timber as well as the Soul Society's suffocatingly dense ratio. Ichigo wrapped his bruised hands around the white cloth on Zangetsu's hilt. He drew the massive black cleaver, its heavy steel sliding free with a low, metallic whisper. He did not run. Running blind through an enemy fortress was a quick death. He closed his eyes briefly, searching for the heavy, silent void in his chest. Where are they? Ichigo expanded his spiritual awareness, looking for Uryu, Chad, or Orihime's distinct signatures. The alarm interrupted the silent god's response. The sudden silence in the courtyard was far worse than the noise. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the terrifying stillness of a jungle just before the predator's attack. You know, falling through a roof is an extremely unattractive way to make an entrance. The voice was smooth, with an arrogant, theatrical tone. Ichigo shifted, bringing the flat of Zangetsu around to protect his chest. 2 soul reapers emerged from the dark arched corridor to his left. The first image depicted a slender, effeminate man with violet eyes and feathers on his right brow and hair. He wore the standard black shiakusho, but an orange, stylized collar fit perfectly around his neck. He looked at the dust on his sleeves with a deep sense of personal offense. Look at this mess, a copy, the feathered Shinigami sighed, dusting his pristine robes delicately. He's ruined the courtyard. Ugliness is a sin, and this boy practically bathes in it. The second man did not mind the dust. He was bald, his head shaved smooth, and gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Sharp, aggressive red markings were painted around the corners of his dark eyes. He held his Zantakudo casually over his shoulder, but his posture was coiled and exuded a violent, barely contained energy. Who cares about the roof? Yumachika. A Kaku Madarame grinned with a wide, vicious smile that revealed sharp, predatory teeth. He focused his dark eyes on Ichigo, taking in the tattered robes, bleeding scrapes, and massive black swords. The alarm indicated that he had a reopening. I didn't expect him to drop right into the stepped forward, his wooden sandals clicking sharply on the polished floorboards that had survived the crash. "You are the one who broke Jidambo's axes, correct?" Akaku inquired, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating growl of pure excitement. "I can smell sweat on you. You are shaking." Ichigo remained calm despite his fear. He was shaking from the agonizing strain of reducing his massive spiritual pressure to an undetectable level. Ichigo said, "I'm looking for the White Tower." His voice was flat, dead and gravel. He pointed the tip of Zangetsu at the bald Shinigami. "Get out of my way so I don't have to cut you down." Yumachika gasped softly and raised a hand to his mouth in mock scandal. "Oh, how barbaric. He has absolutely no manners." Akaku didn't gasp. He threw his head back, laughing loudly and joyfully, which echoed throughout the empty courtyard. "Cut me down." Akaku roared, his red-painted eyes wide with excitement. "You arrogant, little brat. Do you have any idea who you are speaking to? I am Akaku Madarame, the 3rd seed of the 11th Division, the most combat-hungry squad in the whole Goten 13, and me." Akaku drew his sword and tossed the wooden scabbard carelessly onto the ruined tiles. "These are going to be my warm-up." The inner mindscape flooded, causing violent ripples. Naruto Uzumaki sat against a stone pillar, his blue eyes narrowing beneath his black bandages. The crippled god of the void felt a sudden, explosive surge of spiritual pressure coming from the bald Shinigami above. It wasn't as refined as Yoharu's, it wasn't as cold and lethal as Jin Ichimaru's. It was a raging wildfire. It tasted like blood, rust, and the pure, primal joy of violence. Naruto's strong presence anchored Ichigo's spiritual pathways, despite his brawling nature. He lives for the friction between the blades. If you try to match his ferocity, he will drag you to the slaughterhouse. Naruto emphasized the immutable present concept by wrapping a white cloth around Ichigo's grip. "Be the stone, kid. Allow the fire to break out against you." In the courtyard, Akaku did not use a flash step. He charged solely on raw physical power. The bald Shinigami quickly swung his katana at Ichigo's neck, delivering a devastating horizontal slash. Ichigo maintained his composure. He did not spill a single ounce of his pale blue ratio. He kept his energy completely compressed, locking his boots to the floorboards and bringing the massive black cleaver up in a rigid block. Clang! The collision of steel created a shower of orange sparks that illuminated the courtyard. Despite Akaku's massive strike, Zangetsu remained unaffected. The kinetic shockwave was completely absorbed by the hyperdense reishi in Ichigo's blade. Akaku's grin widened as he approached the black steel barrier. Heavy, Akaku cheered, unconcerned that his lethal strike had been stopped dead. "That sword is ridiculously heavy, Ryoki. I thought you were compensating. You have enough wrist strength to hold it." Akaku twisted his blade violently, attempting to sever Ichigo's fingers by sliding the edge down the flat of Zangetsu. Ichigo remembered the harsh lessons from the underground cavern. He did not attempt to outmuscle the redirection. He lowered his center of gravity and sharply angled Zangetsu downward, allowing Akaku's blade to bounce harmlessly off the black steel and strike the wooden floor. Ichigo entered the guarded 3rd seat before Akaku could recover his balance. Ichigo used Zangetsu's heavy, cloth-wrapped pommel to strike Akaku in the sternum. The impact sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a side of beef. Akaku grunted, his breath bursting from his lungs. The bald Shinigami was thrown backward, his wooden sandals skidding across the shattered ceramic tiles before crashing into a wooden support pillar. Yumachika murmured from the sidelines, leaning against the archway. He actually scored a hit. How delightful and unexpected. Akaku slumped against the pillar with his head bowed. The courtyard fell silent, except for the wind whistling through the holes in the roof. Ichigo slowly lowered Zangetsu, leaving the tip pointing at the downed Shinigami. The heavy void in his chest continued to throb, indicating that the fight was far from over. Ichigo breathed deeply, his chest rising and falling. "Get out of my way." A low, dark chuckle echoed from the shadows of the pillar. Akaku gradually pushed himself up. He was not glaring. The vicious, feral grin on his face had grown so wide that it appeared painful. A thin stream of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, but his dark eyes were filled with manic, pure ecstasy. Akaku laughed and wiped the blood from his chin with the back of his hand. "You're fantastic." I haven't felt a hit like that since the captain and I sparred. Akaku moved away from the pillar, rolling his shoulders. His neck bones popped with sharp, audible cracks. His roaring, fiery spiritual pressure surged, filling the courtyard with a bloodthirsty gravity. I take it back, Ryoga, Akaku said, grasping the hilt of his katana with both hands. You're not a warm-up. You're the main event. Akaku raised his sword, resting the back of the blade against his left arm. He slid his hand up the steel, his spiritual pressure condensing quickly. Extend, Akaku said, his voice filled with deadly intent. Kazukamaru. The steel of the katana shifted violently. The blade elongated in a thick wooden shaft emerged from the hilt. In a split second, the standard sword had transformed into a massive, heavy spear topped with a deadly, razor-sharp steel blade. Akaku effortlessly spun the massive weapon over his head, causing a fierce wind through the courtyard, before slamming the butt of the spear against the floorboards. Let's see if that giant cleaver can stop a spear. Ryoga. Akaku yelled. Ichigo tightened his grip on the bloody white cloth. The executioners were waiting in the White Tower, but he couldn't move until he had escaped the 11th Division's vengeance. The courtyard smelled of powdered cedar, ancient dust, and a metallic tang of fresh blood. Akaku Madarame didn't wait for the dust to settle. The bald Shinigami charged, the huge wooden shaft released Zanpakuto working the lever of destruction. He pointed the razor-sharp tip right at Ichigo's chest, the sheer kinetic force of the blow splitting the cold night air with a shrill whistle. Ichigo did not back down. The heavy, silent emptiness in his chest held his boots to the broken ceramic tiles. He raised the huge black cleaver, angling the flat of Zangetsu to meet the tip of the spear. Clang! The impact jarred Ichigo's arms violently. A spear's reach advantage was a whole other kind of nightmare to a sword. Akaku didn't have to get close. He just posted his feet and used the massive shaft to drive his entire body weight into the thrust. Too slow. Akaku yelled, his eyes bulging with a manic, bloodthirsty glee. Akaku made no move to pull his spear back. He immediately twisted his wrists, sweeping the heavy wooden shaft in a brutal horizontal arc at Ichigo's ribs. Ichigo lowered his stance, bringing the massive cleaver down to block. The wood cracked against the black steel, bone jarring. The blow threw Ichigo sideways, his woven sandals rasping along the polished floorboards. You're just hiding behind that big hunk of iron, Akaku jeered, continuing his attack. He was a blizzard of violent motion, spinning the spear over his head, then unleashing a storm of thrusts and wide swings, dizzying to behold. Come out and fight, Ryoga. Show me why you broke the axes of the gatekeeper. Ichigo gritted his teeth, his brown eyes following the silver flash of the spear thrust. He was being choked by the constant pressure. His instinct, the frantic, desperate need to end the fight and reach the White Tower, screamed at him to release his pale blue reishi, to roar and swing with all of his raw, unrefined might to push the madman away. Don't do it, son. The old tired voice echoed from the very core of Ichigo's being. This was not the command of a commander, but the quiet, steady presence of a tired god holding a heavy door closed. Inside the dark, flooded city of the mindscape, Naruto Uzumaki struggled against his chains of rusted iron. The Pharaoh Hollow in the far west was thrashing against its icy prison, smelling the blood of the rising panic, desperate to take control. He wants you to get angry. Naruto projected the heavy, conceptual weight of his anti-energy upward, wrapping it tight around Ichigo's frayed nerves. He's a fighter. Open your valves, roar. You're playing his game, be quiet. Be the rock he breaks his knuckles on. Ichigo closed his eyes for a microsecond. He stopped fighting the backward pull. He drew his chaotic, frantic energy inward, violently compressing his pale blue reishi down into the razor-thin silver edge of Zangetsu. The huge black blade suddenly felt infinitely heavy, anchored in a terrifying, silent gravity. Akaku drove the spear right for Ichigo's throat. Ichigo sidestepped slightly, and the deadly steel tip whistled past his ear. He didn't stop it. He threw himself into the great length of the spear. Akaku's manic grin flickered for a split second. Ichigo swung Zangetsu in a short, hyper-compressed upward arc, targeting the flat of the heavy black steel directly at the wooden shaft of his Uzumaki. It was a terrible blow. Ichigo didn't even try to slice the wood. He had just used the sheer density of the compressed spiritual pressure to completely stop the spear's momentum. A kinetic shockwave shot down the wooden shaft into Akaku's hands, numbingly instant, the Shinigami's fingers. Akaku staggered back, his eyes going wide and his grip nearly slipped. "You!" Akaku gasped, his insane laughter dying in his throat. He looked at the kid with orange hair. The boy was not puffing. He didn't give off an aura of chaos. He stood in the ruined courtyard, among the shattered cedar, holding the black sword with a terrifying deadened calm. "I'm not going to entertain you," Ichigo said in a low gravelly voice, barely heard over the whistling wind. "I have to get to the tower." "Interesting," Yumachika murmured from his place by the archer, absently working at a feather in his hair. "You're totally lost your momentum, Akaku. What an incredibly rude man." Akaku paid no attention to his squawking. A dark and terrible shadow fell over his red-painted eyes. The fun of a spar was out, replaced by a cold, absolute intent to kill. "You think you know the distance, Ryoka?" Akaku hissed, his knuckles going white as he clutched the heavy wooden shaft. Akaku sent the spear flying in a wide arc. But at the height of the weapon's swing, Akaku twisted his dominant hand violently. "Split," Akaku commanded. Clack, clack. The solid wood shaft of Izukumaru snapped at once. It didn't break, but rather broke into 3 separate, heavy wooden sections, connected with thick, unbreakable iron chains. The spear was gone. It was a great 3-part staff. Ichigo's tactical calculation was completely thrown off by the sudden, erratic shift in the physics of the weapon. The bladed end of the weapon did not follow the stiff arc of a spear. The iron chain tightened like a bowstring, and the heavy, steel-tipped section whipped viciously around the edge of Ichigo's blocking sword. Ichigo's eyes went wide. He hurled himself backward, desperately trying to twist his body in the path of the deadly blow. He was slow. Izukumaru's razor-sharp blade sliced across Ichigo's right side, cutting through the black material of his shiakushin, biting deep into his ribs. Ichigo exhaled sharply, breathless. Warm, black blood splashed over the white flagstones. He went down, rolling to avoid a second punishing blow from the heavy wooden center section of the staff. "You can't block what you can't see," Akaku roared, the manic thrill returning in full force as he spun the deadly, chained weapon around his body in a blinding, chaotic blur. Ichigo pushed himself up, his hand pressed to his bleeding side. The pain was a roaring fire, demanding he unleash his suppressed reishi, demanding he unleash his power to heal a wound and overwhelm the madman. The heavy, silent void pulsed in his chest, holding it, fighting the frantic beating of his heart. "If you leap now, you will multiply the blood loss." Ichigo ground his teeth, the copper taste filling his mouth. He seized the white cloth of Zangetsu, smearing his own blood into the fabric. Akaku charged, the 3-section staff whipping through the air like an evil, iron-bound serpent. He lashed out with the bladed tip. The chain snapped with a gunshot. Ichigo didn't try to block the blade. He remembered the lesson of the rushing current in the precipice wood. You can't cut a thing that won't stop, but you can jam the works. Ichigo poured his pale blue reishi into his legs forcefully, every last drop. The boards beneath his boots were smashed to bits. Izukumaru's bladed portion whipped toward his neck and Ichigo ducked right into the mad-spinning radius of the weapon. "What?" Akaku yelled, his eyes bulging wide in complete shock. Ichigo paid no mind to the blade whistling millimeters above his hair. He closed the distance, stepping fully into the deadly range of the iron chains. He lifted the massive cleaver, black in color, but he did not bring it down on Akaku. He drove the heavy, dense flat of Zangetsu right into the whirling iron chains that connected the wooden parts of Izukumaru. The black blade of the 3-section staff violently wrapped around. The weapon instantly and catastrophically snarled. Akaku yanked the wooden handle, struggling to pull loose his Zangetsu, but the incredibly dense gravity of Ichigo's reishi held the chains glued to the black steel like a magnetic vice. "You got me," Ichigo rasped. Zangetsu didn't back down. He held the tangled weapon as an anchor to earth. He twisted his whole body violently, wrenching the wooden handle from Akaku's hand. Akaku stumbled forward, completely disarmed, his guard shattered to pieces. Ichigo pulled out Zangetsu with his left hand. He retracted his arm, his knuckles turning white, and delivered a devastating, completely unrefined bare-knuckle punch right in the middle of Akaku's face. The physical impact was like a slap of the whip. The raw kinetic force lifted the bald Shinigami clear off his feet. Akaku's nose broke, spraying blood as he was thrown back, slamming his back against the broken cedar rafters. The courtyard was now all utterly and dreadfully silent. Izukamaru struck the floorboards with a heavy clatter, instantly changing back from the chained staff into a dull, sealed katana. Ichigo stood over the fallen Shinigami, chest heaving, dark blood pouring freely from the deep cut in his ribs. He raised Zangetsu, the razor-sharp silver edge pointed at Akaku's throat. He didn't let a drop of chaotic energy escape. The heavy, noiseless voice in his chest hummed a slow, steady note of absolute victory. Akaku sprawled in the dust and looked up at the bloody black cleaver. He was breathing hard, his nose was broken. He didn't look angry. He looked up at the orange-haired team with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. You walked right into the chain. Akaku laughed, a weak, wet sound that dripped fresh blood down his chin. You're nuts, Ryoka. Batshit crazy. Akaku let his head fall back against the broken tiles, surrendering himself to the exhaustion. What's your name? Akaku's dark eyes bored into Ichigo's. Ichigo Kurosaki, Ichigo said, his voice a low, heavy rasp. Akaku said, Kurosaki, and memorized the name. His bleeding mouth contorted in a faint, vicious smirk. You won on a level playing field. But you have to hear me out. I'm just the third seed. Akaku weakly raised a trembling hand, and pointed towards the sprawling Seirei behind Ichigo, darkened. You want to get to the White Tower? Akaku coughed, his chest rattles. The captain of the 11th Division is out to get you. Kenpachi Zaraki, you fight him. You will die. He doesn't bleed like any man. If you see a giant, with bells in his hair, run. Ichigo dropped his sword and looked at the defeated man. He didn't swear big vows. He processed the tactical reality of a monster in the white walls. My, oh my. How embarrassing for you, Akaku, Yumachika sighed, stepping daintily out of the shadows of the archway. The winged Shinigami didn't draw his sword. He glanced at Ichigo, then down at the ruined, blood-soaked courtyard. I'll fight you, Kurosaki. Yumachika's voice was dripping with aristocratic contempt. But look at you. You're all bloody and covered in dust. It would be far too hideous to involve you in that state. It offends my aesthetic. Yumachika dropped to his knees beside Akaku, pulling a small clean white cloth from his robes and wiping the blood from his squad mate's face. Go on then. Yumachika waved him off, not looking up. The alarm had not yet sounded, but the medics would be on the way shortly. Run away, I suggest, before the real monsters find you. Ichigo didn't need a second time. The fire in his side was an agonizing clock ticking. Turning his back on the 11th Division, he stepped over the ruined cedar and disappeared into the cold, silent shadows of the Seirei corridors, desperate to find a place to stop the bleeding before the hunt started up again. The Seirei was not a fortress built for siege, but rather a labyrinth designed to isolate and disorient. Ichigo Kurosaki pressed his back against the cold stone of a high perimeter wall, breathing in short, rapid gasps. Every time his chest expanded, a sharp, agonizing fire ripped through his right side. The deep laceration caused by Akaku's chained staff was bleeding profusely, soaking the white sash of his Kakusho in a dark, warm crimson. He looked around the narrow alleyway. The architecture was extremely uniform. Endless corridors with tall white walls, curved clay-tiled roofs, and perfectly smooth paving stones. There were no landmarks. There was no cover. The air was dense with reishi, making it feel like he was breathing underwater and amplifying the scent of his own blood. Ichigo pressed a trembling hand against his ribs to stop the bleeding. If I keep leaving, I will pass out in the middle of the street. He gritted his teeth and shifted the massive weight of Zangetsu onto his back. He forced his boots to move, stepping out of the alley into a slightly larger courtyard. He relentlessly crushed his spiritual pressure downward, burying the chaotic, pale blue ore beneath the heavy, silent gravity of the void in his chest. In a different area of the Court of Pure Souls, a group of unseated Shinigami lay scattered across the pristine courtyard. They were groaning, clutching their bruised ribs and cracked jaws. Their standard issues and Bakuto lay uselessly on the stone tiles, completely unbroken and forcefully discarded. Yasutora Sato stepped over a groaning Soul Reaper, his massive his right arm. He had simply used his overwhelming physical mass and flawless, quiet timing to neutralize the patrol without causing permanent damage. "Stay down," Chad said softly, his voice carrying no malice. "I don't want to break your bones." He looked up at the blue sky, orienting himself by the sun's position. He had no idea where Ichigo, or Ryu, or Orihime had landed. He did, however, know his destination. He turned away from the defeated patrol and resumed his slow, heavy march toward the massive white tower in the center of the Seraite. He walked until the walls stopped him, then he'd break the walls. The inner mind state felt like a flooded city, with dark waters crashing against rusted chains. Naruto Uzumaki opened his bright blue eyes. The crippled god of the void sensed Ichigo's sudden, alarming drop in physical vitality. The boy's mortal vessel was losing blood at a rapid rate, making it difficult to maintain the conceptual grip of the immutable present. Naruto's internal voice echoed through the cold, dark water. "You are faded, kid." He looked to the far west. The jagged mountain of pale blue ice was completely silent, but not in a peaceful way. It was the terrifying silence of a predator waiting for its prey to bleed out. The feral hollow, white, was patiently watching the boy's physical strength dwindle away, waiting for the precise microsecond when the anchor slipped. Naruto commanded Ichigo to find a dark corner while maintaining complete silence. "Stop the bleeding, or the mud will take the wheel." Ichigo stumbled and his shoulder scraped against the white stone wall. His vision was becoming blurry, with dark spots appearing at the edges. The sheer weight of Zangetsu felt like a gravitational anomaly trying to drag him down into the dirt. He entered a narrow, shadowed pathway between two large supply storehouses. It was a dead end. He did not care. He only needed to sit down. Ichigo let his legs buckle and slid down the cold stone wall until he hit the pavement. He exhaled sharply, pulling the torn fabric of his black robes aside to inspect the wound. It was deep, angry, and constantly seeping blood. Clatter. The sound of a wooden Geta sandal tripping over loose paving stones echoed at the narrow pathway entrance. Ichigo's head snapped up. Adrenaline surged through his system, temporarily alleviating exhaustion. He ignored the pain in his ribs and forced himself to his feet. He gripped the white cloth on his hilt, ready to draw the massive black cleaver. Ouch! Oh no! The bandages! A small, frantic figure tumbled into the dead-end pathway, landing face first on hard stone. A canvas medical bag burst open, spilling neat rolls of white gauze, small glass vials, and surgical instruments across the pristine pavement. The figure scrambled to his hands and knees, desperately gathering supplies. He was a short and unassuming soul reaper. He had a mop of tangled black hair, wide, panicked dark eyes, and a posture that screamed perpetual apology. He wore the standard black shiakusho, but a white cloth satchel hung over his shoulder, identifying him as a member of the medical corps. "I apologize. I am so sorry. I wasn't looking where I was." The small Shinigami froze. He looked up from the bandages and saw a tall, bleeding teenager standing at the end of the path. He noticed the strange, torn black robes. He noticed the terrifyingly large black sword resting on the boy's shoulder. Then he noticed the deep orange hair. The medical Shinigami squealed in terror. He scrambled backward until his back met the wall, his trembling hands clutching a roll of gauze to his chest like a shield. You're him," the boy stammered, his face devoid of color. "The alarms, the 11th Division reported that a monster with orange hair and a giant sword broke through the cupola." Ichigo did not swing Zangetsu. He didn't have the strength to take on a terrified medic. He leaned heavily against the stone wall, his brown eyes fixed on the trembling bull. "I'm not a monster," Ichigo said, his voice low and exhausted. He pressed his hand firmly against his bleeding side. "If you're going to call the guards, do so. Otherwise, get out of here." The Shinigami noticed Ichigo's fingers dripping with dark blood on the flawless white stone. Hanataro Yamada held the 7th seat in the 4th Division. His entire existence on the Gotei 13 was defined by sweeping floors, carrying bags, and being yelled at by the combat squad. He was terrified of violence. He was terrified by loud noises. He was absolutely terrified of the Ryoka standing in front of him. However, Hanataro was primarily a healer. He examined the blood. He looked at the pale, sweaty face of the boy who claimed to have defeated the third seed of the Seirei's most violent division. Hanataro remembered the Senzaiku, which was dark and cold. He remembered the quiet, tragic grace of the prisoner he had been tasked with cleaning out later. He remembered Rukia Kuchiki looking out the narrow window of her cell, softly speaking to a stubborn human boy with the ability to change the world. Hanataro swallowed firmly, his atoms apple bobbing in his throat. His hands were shaking so violently that he almost dropped the gauze. He did not run away. He did not yell for the guards. Hanataro slowly pushed himself from the ground. He picked up his canvas medical bag, took a deep, terrifying breath, and took a cautious step forward. Ichigo furrowed his brow. He tightened his grip on Zangetsu, completely perplexed by the abrupt change in the timid boy's demeanor. I said to stay back. Hanataro whispered, You're bleeding severely. His voice cracked. He did not look at the huge sword. He forced his eyes to remain completely focused on the wound. If the laceration is not treated, you will develop hypovolemic shock. You will not make it to Senzaiku. Ichigo froze. The heavy, silent void in his chest produced a sharp throb of surprise. How do you know where I am going? Hanataro stopped 3 feet away and dropped his bag on the pavement. He dropped to his knees, hands hovering over the bloody wound. My name is Hanataro Yamada, he said, closing his eyes tightly and channeling a soft, pale green reishi into his palms. I am the custodial officer assigned to the repentance cell. I clean Kuchiki-san's room. Ichigo's breath was caught in his throat. The agonizing pain in his side was briefly overshadowed by an absolute, desperate need for information. You have seen her? Ichigo demanded, his voice lowered to a harsh whisper. Is she alright? Have they hurt her? Hanataro pressed his glowing green hands against the deep gash on Ichigo's ribs. Ichigo hissed as the healing Kido touched his torn flesh. It didn't burn. Rather, it felt like a cold, soothing liquid that was quickly knitting his muscle and skin back together. She is physically unharmed, Hanataro replied, his eyes tightly shut in terror. But she is extremely sad. She's talking about you, Kurosaki said. She said she had ruined your life. She claimed you deserved to be executed. Ichigo's jaw locked. The cold, unyielding fury he had compressed into the edge of his blade flared, threatening to burst its confines. She was sitting in a cell, ready to die, certain that her sacrifice was the only way to balance the scales. She's an idiot, Ichigo said, staring at the pristine white walls towering above them. I will drag her out of that tower by her collar if necessary. Hanataro's healing light faded slowly. The deep laceration was gone, leaving behind a smooth, pale pink scar. The small medic quickly wrapped a thick layer of white gauze around Ichigo's torso and tied it off with practiced, trembling precision. Hanataro exhaled, sinking back onto his heels and grabbing his medical bag. The bleeding has stopped, but you're still spiritually exhausted. You need to hide. Ichigo tested his side. The agonizing fire had vanished, leaving behind only a dull, manageable ache. He looked down at the terrified, unassuming boy who had just committed high treason to save his enemy. Why did you help me? Ichigo inquired, his brown eyes scanning the medic's face. If they find out you healed a Ryokan, they will also execute you. Hanataro sat with his hands clutching his bag's canvas strap. Hanataro expressed his loyalty to Kuchiki-san, despite his overwhelming fear. No one in the Seirei regards the 4th Division with respect. But she did thank me. She addressed me like a person. If you are the person she believes in, I want you to save her. Hanataro scrambled to his feet and pointed to a heavy iron grate at the end of the pathway. The above-ground routes are completely saturated with patrols, Hanataro said quickly. However, there is an underground sewage network running directly beneath the Seirei. It connects the major barracks to the Senzaiku, and I know the routes. I can assist you. Ichigo focused on the grate before returning his attention to the trembling medic. He did not make a grand declaration of gratitude. He simply recognized the boy as a vanguard member, someone who had made the decision to walk into the fire on his own. Ichigo said, "Lead the way, Yamada," with a low, steady voice of respect. Hanataro rushed to the iron grate with a frantic nod. They pulled the metal cover aside, descending into the dark, damp subterranean labyrinth of the Seirei, disappearing completely from the pristine white streets above, just as the sound of marching sandals echoed through stone, but beneath it sprawled a stifling maze of stagnant water and ancient brickwork. Ichigo Kurosaki trudged through knee-deep freezing runoff, Zangetsu's heavy black steel strapped securely to his back. The air was thick and foul with the smell of mildew and rust and the slow, inevitable decay of centuries. The reishi that was so rich and energizing in the light was oppressive and slow in the dark, clinging to his skin like a damp shroud. Hanataro Yamada held a small glowing Kido lantern a few feet ahead of him. The pale yellow light cast long, trembling shadows against the round brick walls. The little medic was shaking, his knees clattering with every step he took in the icy water. The main junctions are heavily guarded, even down here, Hanataro stammered, his voice echoing softly in the tunnel. He stopped at a junction in the sewer, holding a damp hand-drawn map close to his lantern. But this route, Sector 4, is structurally unsound. The combat squads avoid it because of the danger of cave-ins. Good, Ichigo grunted, his breath misting slightly in the cold. Keep us out of traffic. How far to the tower? Hanataro swallowed and pointed with a trembling finger toward the left tunnel. If we take this aqueduct, it goes straight under the repentance cell. A maintenance grate opens near the bottom of the bridge. Ichigo nodded once and stepped past the small medic to take the lead, putting his own body between Hanataro and whatever might be lurking in the dark. The dull ache in his ribs was a constant reminder of his mortality, but the bleeding had altogether stopped. Hanataro's healing Kido was impressively efficient, repairing vital tissues quickly rather than making cosmetic fixes. The only sound was the rhythmic splashing of their boots in the water. Ichigo's mind wandered to the enormous white tower looming somewhere above them. The burning, desperate need to rip the doors from that cell raged inside him, battling the cold, terrifying fact of the captains that stood guard. Akaki was only the third seat, Ichigo thought, the heavy truth grinding against his bones. That chained staff nearly tore me in half. Jin didn't even try it, he twitched his wrist. He reached back and his fingers grazed the rough white cloth wrapped around the hilt of his massive cleaver. He must be thicker. He had to move fast. Far in the silent void of the inner mindscape, the dark, heavy waters of the spiritual ocean were absolutely still. Naruto Uzumaki was chained to the rusted stone pillar, his head hanging back. The crippled god of the void didn't need physical eyes to see the structural layout of the Seireiki. Naruto could feel the immense, crushing weight of the fortress pressing down on the brick ceiling and sewers, tapping into the ambient reishi filtering down through Ichigo's soul. You're walking under an ocean of monsters, kid. Naruto's internal voice vibrated. A low, heavy rumble in the dark. He increased his total awareness, ignoring the physical stone and following the spiritual signatures that roamed the pristine courtyards above. Most of the signatures were indistinct, organized groups of unseated Shinigami running chaotic patrol rings. But there were moments when colossal, horrible gravity would come drifting over, some lieutenant or captain. The spiritual pressures of them so dense they felt like tectonic plates grinding across the face of the world. Naruto concentrated his anti-energy, coiling the conceptual weight of the immutable present tightly around Ichigo's soul. He crushed the boy's roaring, pale blue Shinigami power into absolute nothingness, not letting a single drop of reishi leak into the surrounding water. Shut up, Naruto muttered to the empty mindscape, a heavy conceptual hand clamping down on the icy prison of the hollow in the far west. The brawler told you about the giant with the bells. I can sense him up there. A natural disaster on foot. If he smells you, the darkness won't protect you. Suddenly, Naruto's reishi bandages, pitch black, began to tighten. He picked up the signature separate from the chaotic patrols over him. It was not the suffocating blaze of the 6th Division captain, nor the terrifying, bloodthirsty gravity of the 11th. It was a roaring aggressive fire. It tasted of blood and ozone and a deep, festering anger. It was moving with absolute, terrifying purpose, following a straight line directly toward the maintenance grade at the end of Sector 4. Stop, Naruto commanded, his voice snapping like a whip through the center of Ichigo's mind. He had it. Ichigo stopped cold. His boots sent waves into the water, which lapped against the brick walls and sank in a dead, heavy silence. Take Kurosaki-san, Hanataro whispered, almost running into Ichigo's broad back. Why did he stop? Ichigo just stared. Slowly he reached behind his shoulder and grabbed the hilt of Zangetsu. The thick, quiet emptiness in his chest beat with a fierce, metronomic warning. hand down over the Kido crystal, plunging the sewer into a suffocating blackness. Ichigo's spiritual senses flared at the pitch darkness. He felt it, without his eyes to distract him. Above them, pressing down through the heavy stone ceiling at the end of the tunnel, was a massive, aggressive spiritual pressure. Like standing too close to an open furnace. There was a familiar violence, the heat Ichigo had tasted intimately in a freezing rain-soaked alleyway in the living room. Ichigo released a long breath silently. With a soft hiss he drew out Zangetsu, the big black steel sliding free. "Stay here, Yamada," Ichigo whispered, stepping into the shadows. "Don't come up the ladder until I say it's clear." "But the grate is right in front of us," Hanataro shivered, completely blind in the dark. "I know," Ichigo said, "and there's somebody on top of it waiting." Ichigo waded through the cold water, slowly and carefully, not splashing too much. He reached the end of the aqueduct. A thin, silvery beam of moonlight came down through a heavy iron grate in the ceiling, lighting a rusty metal ladder bolted to the brick wall. Ichigo swung Zangetsu onto his back, fingers curled around the cold, rusty rungs of the ladder. He didn't think twice. Absolute was the need to reach the tower. He climbed fast, up the shaft until his head was just inches from the iron grate. He dug his boots in tight against the rungs, pushed his hands against the heavy iron bars and heaved upward with a rush of muscle power. The grate shot up with a grating screech, flung itself back, and banged against the stone pavement. Ichigo pulled himself up and out of the dark shaft into the blinding, pure moonlight of the sailing. He stood in a wide-open courtyard which bordered a deep artificial ravine. In the middle of the gorge, somewhat isolated from the rest of the fortress, was the Senzai-ku, the White Tower. A single long stone bridge crossed the gap between courtyard and prison. But Ichigo couldn't step out onto the bridge. 10 yards distant, a tall figure in the moonlight held up the way to the tower. His red hair was tied into a messy, spiky ponytail and held in place with expensive sunglasses. He had tribal tattoos up his forehead, dark ones. He wore the black robes of a soul reaper, the white sleeveless haori of a seated officer flapping madly in the night wind. Renji Abarai held his standard issue katana loosely in the right hand. He stared at Ichigo with the eyes of a predator, eyes burning with a deep, abrasive fury. Renji sneered, his voice rising in an aggressive growl. "I knew you came from the dirt. You always seemed like a rat to me, Kurosaki." Ichigo reached slowly over his shoulder and pulled out the huge black cleaver. The steel was heavy, and in the moonlight it gleamed cold and pitiless. He rested the flat of Zangetsu against his side, brown eyes fixed on the lieutenant. "Renji, I'm surprised they let you out of bed," Ichigo shot back, his voice a low even baritone, completely lacking the chaotic panic that had been in the alleyway. "That was a pretty hard cut I gave you. Did your captain patch you up, or just let you bleed?" Renji's jaw tightened, the tribal tattoos on his forehead twisting into a vicious scowl. The jibe hit home, drove into the bitter, humiliating memory of being betrayed by an untrained human while Byakuya looked on. Lucky in the living world, barked Renji, and his fiery red spiritual pressure came alive, radiating intense heat that instantly dried the sewer water clinging to Ichigo's boots. "You had a stolen sword on you. You were leaking power like a broken faucet." Renji took a slow, deliberate step forward, raising his katana. He looked over the massive, black steel of Zangetsu, his eyes narrowing as he took the weapon in. "But look at you now." Renji's voice was no longer mocking, but a cold, predatory assessment. "The power that was taken is gone. You have your own sword, and you are totally silent. You are not losing a drop of ration." Renji dropped his stance, his hands gripping his hilt. The air around him began to hiss, tasting of ozone and burning metal. "It won't save you," Renji swore, the 6th Division's absolute, unyielding loyalty bleeding through his voice. "You don't know what she's done to me. You don't know what she means to this world. The stray dog of the living world shall not come to rewrite our laws." Ichigo didn't argue. He didn't feel the need to explain his own desperate need to save the girl in the tower. Their wishes were diametrically opposed. Words were useless on Earth. He gripped the bloody white cloth tighter. He reached into the emptiness in his chest, drawing the hyper-dense, pale blue reishi out, packing it entirely into the razor-thin silver edge of the black cleaver. "I don't care about your laws," Ichigo Ichigo said, the very air around Zangetsu warping with the sheer density of his compressed power. Get out of my way, Renji, or I'll break your sword again. Roar, Renji said, a wild grin spreading across his face. Zabumaru. Zabumaru's transformation wasn't a silent unwrapping. It was a violent segmentation, explosive. The mundane illusion shattered, the standard steel of Renji Aburai's katana exploding outwards with a deafening clack clack clack. The blade widened into thick, ragged sections, joined by a flexible spine strengthened with iron. The air around the lieutenant sparked, the surrounding reishi superheating until it tasted of burnt earth and copper. Ichigo Kurosaki did not recoil with the sudden heat wave. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, clutching the great black steel of Zangetsu in his right hand. The deep, rhythmic throb in his chest, the heavy, absolute silence of the void, was like a gravitational anchor, pinning his boots to the pristine white paving stones. Think you're ready for this, Kurosaki? Renji yelled, the tribal tattoos on his brow twisting in fierce, aggressive fury. You think you're a Shinigami because you found your own sword? I've led for this division for decades? Renji flicked his wrist forward. Zabumaru was not swung like a sword. It hit like a striking viper. The heavy segmented whip ripped through the space between them, its razor-sharp teeth aimed to sever Ichigo's right arm and shoulder. Ichigo didn't bother to dodge. He didn't attempt to bat it aside with the flat of his blade. He gripped the bloody white claw of his hilt with both hands and put all his physical weight into his legs. He sucked the bellowing, tumultuous pale blue reishi right into himself, compressing it into the silver edge of his enormous cleaver until the steel vibrated with terrifying, concentrated density. Ichigo swung Zangetsu up in a short, hyper-compressed arm. Krang. The two weapons struck and echoed like a cannon throughout the artificial ravine. White stone was showered with sparks. Zabumaru's jagged teeth bit into the silver edge of Zangetsu, but the whip didn't wrap around the blow. The absolute gravity of Ichigo's hyper-compressed reishi was the perfect counter to the segmented blade, completely locking its momentum. Renji's eyes widened, the vicious, bloodthirsty grin faltering for a split second. The physical shockwave ran straight down the iron spine of Zabumaru, violently jolting his shoulders. Renji tightened his grip on his hilt. He's not leaking. He nailed the shot dead center. That black blade has a weight to it, like hitting a solid iron wall. Is that all? Ichigo's brown eyes locked with the red-headed lieutenants over their crossed blades, rasping. I thought you said you were gonna stop me. The mockery hit Renji like a physical blow. The 6th Division's pride was a violent, unshakable thing in his chest. Don't be cocky, stray dog. Renji yelled. He pulled his wrist back violently. Zabumaru came free of the lock, its segmented whip snapping back faster than the eye could follow. Ichigo had just enough time to shift his footing when Renji spun around, unleashing a barrage of blinding horizontal slashes. The courtyard was a maelstrom of ripping air and bent steel. Ichigo was sent reeling back, his woven sandals scraping against the stone. The giant black cleaver parried and blocked and deflected the relentless assault with terrifying, localized efficiency. Every time Zabumaru struck, Ichigo met it with the hyper-compressed edge of Zangetsu. But the physical toll was immense. The dull ache in his ribs, where Hanataro had sealed the deep laceration, started to flare with a sharp, biting heat. The battle above was mirrored by rhythmic, concussive impacts that reverberated deep beneath the clash of steel in the flooded city of the inner mindscape. The pale blue waters were rippling violently, crashing against the bases of the sideways glass skyscrapers. Naruto Uzumaki was still chained to the great, weathered stone pillar. The crippled god of the void did not struggle against his bonds. His head down, the pitch-black reishi bandages wound tight over his eyes. He concentrated all his awareness on the structural integrity of Ichigo's soul. He's trying to drown you out in volume, kid. Naruto's inner voice rippled through the dark water, a heavy, steadying anchor in the midst of the storm. Naruto lifted out his conceptual senses. He felt the roaring, fiery frequency of the power of the lieutenants. It was aggressive and sprawling, built to overwhelm you. But Naruto could also feel the jagged desperation beneath the red-haired Shinigami's attacks. He's angry, Ichigo. Naruto pushed the observation up, heavy and ancient, sliding it into the boy's tactical awareness. But the anger is not for you. He's fighting his own guilt. His punches are wide. They are too emotional and not focused enough. Watch the shoulder. He sends a telegram rescinding it. Naruto concentrated on the immutable present, and pressed hard down on the icy prison in the far west. Feral hollow thrashed, smelling blood, smelling rising exhaustion, begging to be let off the leash. Naruto drowned the beast in roars with pure silence, making sure Ichigo's mind was crystal clear. Ichigo felt the subtle shift in his perception, the grounding in the physical world. In that blur of chaos, Renji's lips seemed to slow down fractionally. He ceased staring at the jagged teeth of Zabumaru. He was looking at Renji's right shoulder. There you have it. The muscles in Renji's shoulder twitched slightly, tensing as if he were ready to snap the segmented blade into a devastating low sweep aimed at Ichigo's knee. Ichigo didn't retreat. He made no effort to brace himself for the impact. He pushed off his back foot, launching himself right into the path of the blow. You idiot! Renji roared and snapped his wrist forward to deliver the killing blow. But Ichigo was no longer within optimal range of the whip. Zabumaru's bladed segments whistled past his calves as he stepped inside the arc, missing their mark completely. Ichigo was now less than 2 feet away from the lieutenant. Renji's eyes went wide with sheer shock. The aggressive, roaring fire of his spiritual pressure ceased. He had pushed too far. Ichigo brought Zangetsu up, not in a wide, sweeping slash, but in a brutal, compact thrust. He slammed the flat, heavy side of the huge cleaver down on Renji's sternum. The physical impact sounded like a car accident. Renji's breath exploded out of his lungs in a violent rush of air and spittle. The sheer kinetic force of the blow sent the tall Shinigami flying completely off his feet. Renji went flying backwards, soaring through the night air before landing hard on the clean paving stones, rolling crazily towards the edge of the man-made ravine. Zabumaru crashed down on the stone, and instantly shrunk back into its sealed, mundane form. Ichigo stood in the center of the courtyard, his chest heaving, his brown eyes burning with a cold, blue fire. He didn't go for him right away. He gripped his massive sword, breathing harshly and raggedly into the silence of the night. Renji lay on his back looking up at the bruised, moonlit sky. His chest pulsed with a blinding, choking pain. He couldn't get a breath, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the crushing, absolute humiliation grinding into his soul. He had lost the moral high ground. He'd lost his bearings. A month ago, he didn't even know what a hollow was, and now some teenager had completely overpowered him. Why is this? Renji thought, in a chaotic bitter storm, trying to push himself up onto his elbows. Why is he so powerful? Why can't he just lay down? Renji thought of the dark, damp streets of the Rukongai ghetto. He remembered the hunger in the alleys, stealing water to stay alive one more day. He remembered a little girl with dark hair, who had shared her stolen food with him, his only kin in a world that didn't care if they lived or died. He joined the Gote 13 so she could have a better life. He played by the rules, climbed the ranks, bowed before the nobles. Also Rukia Kuchiki would never go hungry again. And she had broken the final law. She had thrown her life away for a random human in the world of the living. Renji forced himself to his knees, fingers digging into the cold white stone. He reached out and grabbed the hilt of the sealed Zanbakuto, leaning on it to help his battered body stand up again. You don't understand, Renji hissed, blood flowing from his chin to stain the white collar of his lieutenant's cowl. Ichigo clutched Zangetsu closer. She's in a cell, waiting to be executed for saving my family. I know that. That's all the math I mean. She is a woman. Renji roared, the bitter festering anger finally erupting. His spiritual pressure, burning like a flame, flared up again, out of control. She's a member of Clan Kuchiki. The law is absolute. If you fuck with the law, you fuck with the whole history of Soul Society. You can't save her, Kurosaki. You're just smearing her name before she dies. Renji drew his katana, his hands shaking with rage and fatigue. I won't let you get to that tower, Renji promised, his voice cracking under the intense weight of emotion. I will slay you myself before I permit you to besmirch her reputation further. Howled, Zabumaru. The blade split again, the heavy iron teeth snapping into place. Ichigo looked at the desperate, bleeding lieutenant. He saw the tragic, deep contradiction that was rending the man asunder. Renji didn't want Rukia to die. He was just so enmeshed in his total, choking devotion to a system that Ichigo lifted Zangetsu, resting the gargantuan black cleaver on his right shoulder. The air around him ceased to stir. The ambient radiance of the Seirei seemed to recoil violently from the hyper-dense, pale blue singularity forming along the edge of his blade. "If that's your law," Ichigo said, brown eyes locking onto Renji with an immovable resolve, "then I'm going to break it. And if you face that tower, I'll shatter you as well." The air in the courtyard was not merely warming up, it was beginning to physically warp, quivering like the air just over a blazing asphalt road in the middle of summer. Renji Aburai stood at the edge of the artificial ravine, a fiery aggressive red ration pouring from his body, no longer a controlled aura. It was a frantic, desperate hemorrhage. His tribal tattoos glowed so stark and vivid against his pale skin, soaked with sweat, as he burned his own soul to drive the huge whip of Zabumaru, segmented from tip to hilt. "You will take not one more step," Renji roared, his voice shredding his vocal cords. He didn't beat it. His hands came together, gripping the hilt of his Zanpakuto with a desperate white-knuckled grip. He poured every drop of his corkscrewing, bleeding spiritual pressure straight into the iron spine holding the heavy, jagged teeth. The Zabumaru didn't just get longer, it duplicated. The blades split and flew into the dark sky, stretching out to an impossible length. The whip writhed and twisted like a great dragon of iron scales above, blotted out all the silver moonshine. As it moved, the weight of the weapon conjured a localized hurricane that whipped the dust and broken stone across the courtyard. Ichigo Kurosaki did not lift his eyes to the iron beast hovering above him. His brown eyes didn't leave the desperate man with the bleeding hand holding the leash. The dull, biting ache in Ichigo's ribs thumped a steady rhythm, but he pushed past the pain, buried it under the heavy, suffocating gravity of his own intent. Deep in the silent void of the inner mindscape, the dark waters crashed heavily against the rusted chains. Naruto Uzumaki's blue eyes sparkled. The crippled god of the void could feel the astronomical heat radiating from the lieutenant above him. It wasn't the heat of a master doing a perfect technique. It was the frantic, uncurved blaze of a man burning down his own house to keep an intruder out. "Ichigo, he's throwing everything he's got left," Naruto's voice echoed in the dark water. The ancient, tired voice had no orders, no sterile analysis of the battlefield. It was only the heavy, weary wisdom of one who had seen too many desperate men break themselves upon the rock. "Don't touch it," Naruto whispered, directing the complete silence directly into Ichigo's trembling muscles. "He is swinging a mountain. If you try to lift it, it'll grind your bones to dust. You only have to cut the foundation." Naruto focused the conceptual weight of a immutable present to make sure Ichigo's chaotic need did not bleed out into a wasted roar. "Breathe the cold, kid. Steal a lot of it, then release it." In the courtyard, Ichigo inhaled slowly and raggedly. His lungs were full of ozone and burned stone. He gripped the bloody white rag around the hilt of Zangetsu tighter. He never bent his knees to brace. He just stood there, perfectly still, violently squeezing his pale blue reishi into the razor-thin silver edge of the gigantic black cleaver. The air was gone around the blade, replaced by a terrible, heavy singularity of power. With a guttural, agonized scream, Renji dropped his arms. A huge iron beast with a coil fell from the sky. Zabumaru. It didn't snap like a single whip. It crashed down like a falling iron cage, trying to utterly crush Ichigo beneath thousands of pounds of jagged, segmented steel. Ichigo looked up at the raining iron. He did not retreat. He walked on straight, completely unaware of the great shadow that loomed over him. He swung Zangetsu in a savage two-handed vertical arc, not at the falling teeth but at the heart of Renji's roaring red energy. He didn't merely swing the steel, he released the hyper-compressed ration that was crammed into the edge. A massive crescent-shaped wave of blinding, pale blue energy erupted from the black blade. It ripped upwards, washing the dark courtyard in a terrifying, sapphire light. The pale blue wave slammed into the falling iron mass of Zabumaru. There was no metallic sound as the two objects collided. It went cataclysmically, deafeningly crash. The sheer density of Ichigo's compressed knee was a physical wedge, tearing completely through the center of the lieutenant's ultimate strike. Less than BR, greater than less than BR, greater than Zabumaru's iron-reinforced bulk sections burst outwards, its spine of chain snapping in a dozen places. Shrapnel rained down on the white paving stones like broken glass. The blue Reishi tidal wave rolled on. It passed through the broken remains of the whip and hit Renji Abarai in the chest. Renji took the physical impact and his eyes became wide in absolute paralyzing shock. His spiritual pressure, a roaring red, was instantly, violently extinguished. The kinetic force sent him flying, his boots entirely off the ground. A deep, horrible slash across his chest sprayed dark crimson blood into the night air. He fell flat on the white stones, rolling wildly until his head struck the bottom of a decorative stone lantern. The courtyard went completely silent. The massive pieces of Zabumaru clattered against the pavement, completely dead and still. The severed segments did not recoil, they lay scattered like the broken bones of a slain beast. Ichigo stood in the center of the ruin, chest heaving, breath misting in the freezing air. Zangetsu's massive black steel weighed heavily on his shoulder. The dull ache in his ribs turned to sharp pain, but he would not get to his knees. He picked his way across the broken pavement slowly, his woven sandals crunching on the debris, till he stood over the fallen lieutenant. Renji lay on his back, gazing up at the sky, dark and bruised. The blood beneath him was warm, soaking into the white collar of his haori. His arms wouldn't move. His lungs rattled wetly and heavily with each breath he tried to take. The physical pain was blinding, but the weight of the reality was crushing and infinitely worse. He had lost. He had burned his soul, broken his Zanpakuto, and it still hadn't been enough. The stray dog from the living world had shattered his fangs to bits. Why is this? Vision blurred as the cold night air bit at his skin. Renji thought. Why's he up there and I'm down here? It took me decades of practice. I bleed for this rank. Renji forced his heavy, unfocused eyes up to the orange-haired teenager standing above him. Ichigo was not gloating. There was no trace of malice or triumph in his brown eyes. They had a cold, ironclad determination that Renji had never seen from any of the pristine, patrician captains of the Gode 13. It was the look of someone with nothing to lose and everything to protect. Renji's mind drifted, the scent of the blood pulling him back in time. Even when there had been no rain, the dirt of the Inazuri district was always wet. His stomach was empty and scraped with hunger. He remembered a little girl with big rebellious dark eyes who had offered him a stolen piece of fruit. Renji, Rukia vowed fiercely, her voice steady. We're going to be Shinigami. We're going to get out of the dirt. They climbed out of the dirt, but she had been carried off. She had been born into the world of white houris and perfect stone, separated from him by an ocean of ancient laws and noble pride. All his life he had tried to lift himself high enough to stand beside her again, and he had made himself the very executioner that was to drag her to the block. A hot, stinging wetness collected in the corners of Renji's eyes, mixing with the dirt and blood on his tattooed face. He could not save her. The laws were too weighty. The captains were just too good. But this boy, this stubborn, completely impossible human being who broke gates and smashed seas with his bare hands. Renji shoved all his broken pride out of the way. He did not care a fig for his rank. He didn't care for the Gode 13. He forced his broken body to move, pulling his bloody right hand over the clean white paving stones. His fingers, trembling and bloody, reached weakly for the hem of Ichigo's tattered black shiakishin. Ichigo's gaze dropped, his jaw tightened as he saw the tears tracing through the dust on the lieutenant's face. Kurosaki. Renji rasped out a broken wet whisper that barely carried over the wind. A violent, bloody cough shook his chest. Still he did not loosen his grip on the black cloth. I know I have no right to ask this, Renji sobbed, the absolute despair finally breaking through his abrasive shell. I'm a pussy, I know. I know I stood by and let them condemn her. Renji closed his eyes tight and hot tears streamed down his cheeks. But, I beseech you, said the lieutenant, clinging to the winds his honor, his rank, and his life. Please, save her. Save Rukia. The courtyard was deathly silent except for the sound of Renji's ragged, desperate sobbing. Ichigo looked down at the broken man clinging to his robes. He didn't see an enemy now. He saw a man utterly broken by the needs of his own heart. A man whose desperate need to defend himself had been strangled by the very system in which he had put his faith. In Ichigo's chest, the heavy, silent voice throbbed with an unshakable and deep respect. Ichigo didn't kick the hand away, he didn't give some grand, dramatic speech. He reached down, gently pried Renji's bloody hand from his robes, his fingers bandaged and bruised. Slowly he laid the lieutenant's arm back on the cold stone. Ichigo's voice was low and heavy, a rumble carrying the absolute certainty of stone. I know. That's why I'm here. Renji's eyes fluttered closed, a shuddering breath leaving his lungs as the crushing weight was finally passed on. The lieutenant fell back into unconsciousness, his deep ragged sobbing fading into the stillness of the night. Ichigo stood, wiping a smear of his own blood from his chin. He turned his back on the fallen lieutenant, his brown eyes settled on the great, solitary stretch of the Senzai looming far away. He shifted the black steel of Zangetsu's weight on his shoulder. The first wall came down. The chase was gaining speed. He slipped into the shadows of the Seireitun, full of silence, and moved inexorably towards the White Tower. The courtyard's white stone was not white anymore. It was marked by ragged trenches and broken debris, and the dark, cooling blood of the lieutenant. Ichigo Kurosaki stopped his woven sandals and turned away from the broken heaving stones. The adrenaline that had carried his frantic, hyper-compressed strikes against Zabumaru was bleeding out of him quickly, leaving nothing but a cold, hollow exhaustion that sank directly into the marrow of his bones. He held onto the cloth-wrapped hilt of Zangetsu, and the massive flat of the black steel rested on his shoulder. It was 10 times heavier than it had been 10 minutes ago. With every step he felt the strain of the new, tender scar tissue on his ribs where Hanataro had closed the mortal wound. He ducked into the shadowed archway of a nearby barracks, leaning heavily against the smooth stone wall. He shut his eyes, resisting the desperate, choking need to sit down for 5 minutes and shut his eyes. Plump. A small, heavy iron grate moved a few yards down the corridor and slowly slid to one side. Hanataro Yamato thrust his untidy black hair out of the dark aperture. The little medic was looking around frantically, his dark eyes wide with stark terror. He saw the ruined courtyard a ways off. He saw the unconscious bleeding body of Renji Aburai in the midst of the shattered stone. And then he saw Ichigo, leaning against the wall, very much alive. Hanataro climbed from the sewage grate, dragging his canvas medical bag behind him. He didn't take off. He sprinted to the kid, his hands fidgeting above the torn and bloody cloth of Ichigo's shiakusho. You beat Lieutenant Aburai, Hanataro whispered, his voice trembling with great awe and utter terror. He is one of the strongest men in the Gode 13. And you just walked away. He's alive, Ichigo croaked, struggling to open his heavy eyelids to look at the medic. He just needs a doctor. You know you gotta show me the steps. Hanataro swallowed hard and nodded quickly. Why yes. We're nearly there. The corridor outside leads straight down to the base of the Senzai. But Kurosaki-san, your Riki is completely unstable. You're trembling. Ichigo stared down at his hands. Hanataro was correct. His bandaged fingers trembled violently on the black steel. The air tonight wasn't cold. His body, his flesh and bone, desperately fighting the immense, unnatural strain holding the hyper-dense Shinigami ration. Ichigo growled and pushed himself away from the wall. I can hold it. Show me the way. Beneath the quivering physical muscles, the flooded city of the inner mindscape felt the catastrophic strain. The peace of the waters of the spiritual ocean was broken. They churned up and down in erratic choppy waves that crashed heavily against the sides of sideways tall skyscrapers. Naruto Uzumaki's mouth was set in absolute concentration. The crippled god of the void sat against the great stone pillar, his rusted iron chains pulled tight to the point of agony. His eyes were covered, pitch-black reishi bandages, soaked, dark spiritual blood trickling down his cheeks and disappearing into the turbulent water. He was keeping the foundation from falling apart by sheer conceptual force. Your ship is splitting, kid, Naruto's voice echoed through the dark water in his head. It was a heavy, ancient rumble, quite without military stiffness, and only with a deep, tired sympathy. You squeezed the fire too hard. The iron is beginning to warp. Naruto turned his gaze to the far western edge of the mindscape. Hala, the wild white, was fully awake. Huge, glowing red fissures ran across the jagged mountain of pale blue ice. The beast could feel the exhaustion. It could smell the frayed ends of Ichigo's absolute resolve. It was thrashing violently against the frost, desperate to break free and devour the boy's fading consciousness. Stay down, Naruto said to the empty dark, forcing another wave of immutable presence over the cracking ice. He didn't shout. He issued no tactical orders. He just ran his own absolute, conceptual silence down into the boy's frantic, racing heartbeat like a heavy stone on a fluttering paper sail. Breathe in the cold air each day. Don't look at the blood. See the tower. First Hanataro entered the maze of white high walls. They stayed in the deepest shadows, avoiding the clear moonlight that bathed the open courtyards. The sirens had stopped since Ichigo crashed through the roof, but the silence was a total sham. The reishi around Seirei was thick and rolling, humming with the movement of hundreds of unseen Shinigami scrambling to lock down the perimeter. There's Hanataro pointed a trembling finger. They came to the end of a long covered walkway. In the middle of the deep, artificial ravine, completely alone, stood the Senzai-Cube. It was a huge edifice of perfect white stone, soaring hundreds of feet into the scarred night sky. An impossibly long stone bridge connected the walkway directly to a huge set of iron doors at the foot of the tower. Ichigo stared at the white tower. Near the top somewhere, the girl who had saved his sister was locked away, drowning in guilt of her own. The heavy, silent void in his chest pulsed with a deep, undeniable absolute mood. The weariness in his legs was gone, replaced by a cold, frantic adrenaline. I'm going up. Ichigo moved out of the shadows. Stop. Hanataro's hand gripped the sleeve of Ichigo's ragged robes. We can't just walk over the bridge. There are guards. Hanataro's voice caught in his throat immediately. The little medic's dark eyes flew wide in pure, dead, paralyzed terror. He fell to his knees on the stone flags, hands clawing at his throat as if all the air had been sucked violently from the corridor. Ichigo stopped. He didn't just feel spiritual pressure. He felt the weight of physical catastrophe settle on his shoulders. It wasn't Byakuya Kuchiki's refined, stifling glacier. It wasn't that lethal, concentrated razor edge of Jin Ichimaru. It was like standing at the bottom of an ocean of warm coagulated blood. It was a raging avalanche of pure primal violence, unadulterated. It was impossibly dense, aggressively chaotic enough that the very air was warm, the pristine white walls of the corridor vibrating violently. Ching! The small, delicate bell sounded with a crushing gravity. Ching! From the shadows of the arched walk just behind them the sound came. Ichigo couldn't breathe. The air was too thick with a bloodlust so old and horrifying that every survival instinct in his mortal body yelled at him to drop his sword and play dead. He ground his teeth, tasting copper, and forced his stiff neck to turn. Out of the darkness came a giant of a man. He was very tall, and he wore the black robes of a Soul Reaper, but his haori was torn, frayed, and there were no sleeves at all. His hair was wild and spiky black, twisted into scraggly points, each with a tiny silver bell at the end. His right eye was covered by a ragged black eye patch. The other left eye was not human. It was a black bottomless pit of sheer happy savagery. A small girl with pink hair, wearing a Shinigami uniform, was sitting on the giant's huge shoulder, swinging her legs happily as if she were out for a Sunday stroll. Well, said the giant. His voice was a deep, gravelly purr and it vibrated the stone under Ichigo's boots. I followed the trail of broken bones and look what I found. The little Ryoka that knocked the talking out cold. Captain of the 11th Division. Kenpachi Zaraki. Hanataro Yamada was flat out on the ground. Zaraki's passive spiritual pressure was actively crushing the small medic, suffocating him with its sheer, unrefined density. He couldn't even breathe to scream. Ichigo stood his ground, but the physical toll was agonizing. He leaned heavily on Zangetsu, using the huge black cleaver like a crutch to keep his knees from buckling. You're shaking, kid, Zaraki said, a wide, terrible grin splitting his scarred face. He did not reach for the chipped and well-worn katana at his hip. That's good. Fear makes the blood flow. It makes the cut taste good. The little girl on his shoulder giggled and pointed a little finger at Ichigo. Kenny, look, he has orange hair. Oh, it looks like a carrot. Zaraki laughed, a harsh barking laugh with no warmth. Yeah, Yachi, Zaraki agreed, his single bloody eye on Ichigo. He's a colorful guy. Let's see what color he bleeds. The dark waters exploded violently deep within the mindscape. Naruto Uzumaki planted his hands on the cracked stone floor. The heavy iron chain desperate. Naruto's voice tore through the chaotic, swirling water to anchor the boy's frayed mind. He is a force of nature. Your edge is too thin. If you attack that monster now, your sword will break and he will cut you in half. In the hallway, Ichigo heard the heavy, desperate warning of the void in his chest. He looked up at the giant. He felt the terrifying, unmovable weight of Zaraki's spiritual pressure. It was not an ocean he could freeze, and it was not a mountain he could climb. It was a meat grinder, made for the job of chewing up raw power and spitting out the bones. I'm not here for you, Ichigo rasped, his voice vibrating with the tremendous effort alone to speak against the crushing gravity. He gestured with his left hand at the great iron doors of the Sensei behind him. I'm going to the tower. Zaraki's smile faded. The happy anticipation was immediately succeeded by a cold, absolute boredom. The tower, Zaraki muttered, his shoulders sagging slightly. You came all this way to play rescuer with that Uchiki brat? I thought you came here to fight. Zaraki took one slow step forward. The air pressure surged violently. Hanataro made a wet choking sound and his face turned pale blue. I don't care about the girl, Zaraki said lazily, his huge hand resting on the hilt of his chipped, rusted sword. I don't care about the laws, the Ryoka invasion, the alarm bells. I just want to know if you're strong enough to entertain me. Zaraki drew his blade. It was a hunk of broken and mangled iron, with no grace or polished razor whatsoever. It was a butcher's knife that had been left out in the rain for 10 years. If you ain't gonna fight me, kid, whispered Zaraki, the absolute promise of violence hanging heavy in the cold air, then I'm just gonna chop you to pieces and go find a nap. There was no choice for Ichigo. The bridge to the tower had been cut. The small medic bleeding on the floor was dying just from proximity to the captain. Ichigo took Zangetsu's white claw with both hands. This time he didn't fold his power into a quiet edge. He couldn't do it. It was a death sentence, absolute silence against the crushing, apocalyptic weight of the 11th Division captain. He turned on the valve. The pale blue reishi was dense, hyper-compressed. It exploded outward violently, shattering the pristine paving stones beneath his feet. It was the Shinigami power, chaotic and glory, that poured into the corridor, physically pushing back the ocean of blood radiating from the giant. Zaraki's eye got bigger. The terrifying, happy grin returned with a vengeance, distorting his scarred face into a mask of pure ecstasy. That's it, Zaraki roared, the little bells in his hair jingling madly in the sudden violent wind. Show me what you got. The corridor's air snapped violently, as if caught in a tug-of-war between two powerful forces. Ichigo Kurosaki's pale blue reishi erupted like a geyser, tearing through the suffocating, blood-soaked gravity of the 11th Division captain. The sudden outward explosion of Shinigami power shattered the remaining paving stones, sending jagged chunks of white debris flying off the pristine walls. Hanataro Yamada gasped loudly and drew uncompressed oxygen into his starved lungs. He collapsed to his hands and knees, shivering uncontrollably as the crushing weight was removed from his chest. Come back, Yamada, Ichigo roared above the deafening hum of his own spiritual pressure. He did not look at the medic. His brown eyes were completely focused on the giant standing before the Senzaiku bridge. Kenpachi Zaraki remained unafraid of the roaring blue fire. The wide, terrifying grin on his scarred face only widened, the single, unpatched eye widening with pure, intense excitement. Shing! Shing! Zaraki's silver bells chimed as he rolled his massive shoulders. Zaraki's voice was deep and gravelly, cutting through Ichigo's aura. It's much better. You have a lot of raw fuel in there, kid. It's messy and loud, but it carries real weight. The tiny, pink-haired girl on his shoulder giggled and clapped her hands. Penny is happy now, Yachiru exclaimed. She pushed off the giant's shoulders and leapt backward through the air with incredible grace. She softly landed on the bridge's stone railing from dozens of yards away, dangling her legs over the deep, artificial ravine. Kenny, don't break him too fast. Zaraki let out a harsh barking laugh. He rested the flat of his chipped, rusted katana against his broad shoulder, exposing his entire chest and neck. Okay, Ryoka, Zaraki challenged, taking a wide, open stance. He pressed a large, calloused finger against the center of his own chest. You take the first swing. Anywhere you want. Make it count. Ichigo gritted his teeth. The complete, arrogant disregard for defense was was not a ruse. Zaraki was completely, terrifyingly confident that nothing Ichigo possessed could possibly harm him. Ichigo's desires clashed violently. The primal human instinct to turn and run from the walking natural disaster yelled at him to flee. However, the desperate, undeniable need to reach the White Tower, to bring Rukia out of the darkness, forced his boots to stay firmly planted on the stone. He gripped Zangetsu's bloody white cloth with both hands. He yanked the roaring, pale blue reishi tighter, forcing it down into the razor-thin silver edge of the massive cleaver. He bent his knees. Crack! Ichigo leapt forward in a split second. The kinetic force of his launch crushed the stone beneath his sandals. He did not aim for the chest. He aimed directly at the giant's exposed neck. He swung Zangetsu with all his physical strength and spiritual density. It was a flawless, devastating horizontal arc intended to completely separate the head from its shoulders. Deep within the inner mindscape, the dark ocean waters became completely still. Naruto Uzumaki sat against the weathered stone pillar, his reishi bandages pointing toward the sky. The crippled god of the void did not attempt to stop the swing. He did not direct his anti-energy upward. He simply watched as the physical vessel committed completely to the strike. Naruto's internal voice said, "You are swinging at a mountain, kid, without panic and laden with the weary reality of the battle. Your edge is sharp, but his skin is forged from unrelenting bloodlust. Prepare for recoil." Naruto gripped his rusted iron chains, bracing himself for the impending impact. The silver edge of Zangetsu struck Kenpachi Zaraki's neck. There were no sounds of tearing flesh. There was no spray of red blood. There was only a deafening metallic clang, similar to raw iron striking a solid anvil. Ichigo's eyes widened in utter horror. Zangetsu did not cut the captain. The razor-sharp edge of the colossal black cleaver was pressed directly against Zaraki's bare skin, but it failed to break through. The physical recoil was catastrophic. Ichigo's maximum output sent a kinetic shockwave back through Zaraki's skin and Zangetsu's black steel. Ichigo's wrists abruptly snapped back. The skin on his palms ripped open, and hot blood soaked the white cloth wrapper. A sharp, breathless gasp erupted from his throat as the bones in his forearms groaned under the impossible pressure. He stumbled backward, lost his footing, and his arms went numb from the elbow down. Zaraki hadn't moved a millimeter. The giant stood motionless, the bells in his hair chiming softly. He slowly reached up and rubbed the side of his neck where the massive cleaver had struck. There was not even a red mark. Zaraki let out a long and heavy sigh. The terrifying, joyful grin vanished from his scarred face, replaced by deep, profound disappointment. What the hell was that? Zaraki grumbled, his single eye looking down at Ichigo with contempt. I gave you a free shot. I stood perfectly still, and you couldn't even scratch me. Ichigo focused on his trembling hands and the chipped, rusted sword held by the giant. Ow! Ichigo rasped, his voice filled with disbelief. I packed the reishi, and swung as hard as I could. You swung a heavy piece of iron, Zaraki corrected, lowering his voice to a dangerous level. Your spiritual pressure is loud, but it's completely ineffective. You swing with hesitation. You are terrified. Zaraki took a slow and heavy step forward. You can't cut me because my Ryoku is denser than yours, Zaraki said, citing a simple, unbreakable law of the Soul Society's physics. Spiritual battles are simply a grinding of energies. If your blade lacks the density to penetrate my aura, it will never reach my skin. And now, kid, your blade is blunt as a rock. Zaraki raised his chipped and ruined katana. My turn. The giant did not use a flash step. He did not use a specific technique. He simply lowered the rusted blade with a casual, one-handed vertical swing. Ichigo did not have time to dodge. Zaraki's aura was so powerful that it paralyzed his leg. He forced his numb, bleeding hands to grip Zangetsu, lifting the massive flat of black steel horizontally over his head to block. The chipped katana hit Zangetsu. The impact was unlike Jin Ichimaru's microscopic, piercing strike. This was the blunt, overwhelming force of a collapsing structure. Ichigo immediately fell to his knees. The pristine white paving stones beneath him shattered, leaving a small, jagged crater around his boots. His lungs were violently crushed, and he lost his breath. The heavy, black steel of Zangetsu was forced downward, and the dull, rusted edge of Zaraki's blade stopped just inches from Ichigo's forehead. Ichigo grinded his teeth, blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. The muscles in his shoulders screamed, tearing from the sheer, impossible weight of holding the giant back. Zaraki whispered, leaning on his sword and looking down at Ichigo's terrified expression. "You are weak. You're fighting because you believe you need to, not because you want to. You're just trying to survive." Zaraki kicked his right foot forward and drove his heavy wooden sandal into Ichigo's stomach. Ichigo vomited blood and saliva, losing his grip on Zangetsu. He was thrown backward, tumbling violently across the ruined courtyard before colliding with a heavy stone pillar. He crumpled to the ground, unable to draw any breath. "Kurosaki-san!" Hanataro screamed, tears streaming down the small medic's cheeks. He attempted to scramble forward, reaching for his medical bag. Zaraki did not look at the medic. He simply increased his spiritual pressure by a fraction of a percent. Hanataro was slammed against the stone pavement, pinned by gravity like a crushed insect. Zaraki walked slowly through the courtyard, dragging the tip of his chipped katana against the stone. The metal shrieked, launching a shower of sparks into the darkness. Ichigo lay against the pillar, his vision filled with dark and erratic spots. His right hand twitched, desperately searching the cold stone for his sword hilt, but Zangetsu had already fallen several yards away. "It's a shame," Zaraki said, pausing a few feet from Ichigo's prone body. "You had a good look in your eyes at the gate, but you're just a kid playing with a sword that is too large for you." Zaraki raised his rusted katana, the moonlight catching the jagged, unrefined edge of the steel. "I'll make it quick," Zaraki promised without malice. Ichigo was torn apart by conflicting desires as he stared up at the descending blade. The absolute terror of his impending death screamed loudly, attempting to drown out the silent, steadfast desire to keep the promise he had made to Rukia. As the rusted steel fell toward his neck, the silent void in the center of his chest suddenly expanded. The deep, ancient voice resonated directly with Ichigo's fracturing consciousness. Naruto Uzumaki stood up from deep within the mindscape. The heavy, rusted chains scraped violently against the stone pillar. "Ichigo, stop trying to cut his skin." Naruto's voice pierced through the paralyzing terror, an absolute, unyielding command that shook the boy's bones. "A shield cannot cut through a storm. Let go of your fear. Grab the blade and end the silence." Ichigo's right hand shot out. He did not reach for Zangetsu. He reached straight up, his bare, bloody fingers completely intercepting Zaraki's descending, rusted katana. The blade came to a stop. Zaraki's eyes widened in genuine shock. Ichigo used his bare hand to catch the captain's razor-sharp sword blade. Blood poured rapidly from his palm and down his forearm, but he did not flinch. He looked up at the giant, his brown eyes no longer wide with fear. They were absolutely, terrifyingly cold. The chaotic, roaring pale hue that had been leaking from his body was immediately and violently sucked back inside, replaced by a dense, suffocating gravity that tasted entirely of the void. "I'm not playing," Ichigo rasped, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that caused Zaraki's hair-bells to stop chiming. The serrated, rusty edge of the katana dug painfully into the bare flesh of Ichigo Kurosaki's palm. Warm dark blood ran over the dull steel and dripped steadily on the shattered white paving stones below them. The physical pain was excruciating, the agonizing feeling of iron grinding against his finger bones. But Ichigo did not yell. He wouldn't let go. Kenpachi Zaraki looked at the hand of the teenager, the small silver bells in his hair silent. The giant's great physical bulk, the spiritual pressure that seemed to roar from him, should have been more than enough to crush the boy's fingers and split his skull as he pushed down. The blade did not budge. It wasn't a physical block. The atmosphere in the ruined courtyard had changed, violently, fundamentally. The pale blue fire had roared and boiled out of Ichigo, and now it was gone. Instead, there was a great, choking vacuum. The ambient ratio of the Seiradium was no longer being pushed away, it was being violently sucked inwards, collapsing into the absolute center of Ichigo's chest. Zaraki's one eye widened. He could feel it. He felt his own aura, thick and bloodied, sucked into the boy's space, consumed by a terrifying, unyielding silence. "I told you," Ichigo said, the words coming out without a trace of panic. It was cold, killing, complete. Ichigo wrung his bloody left hand violently. He did not attempt to overpower the giant's arm. He shifted the super dense gravity hitting his body, angling Zaraki's blade sideways and tearing the rusted steel from his palm in a spray of red. Ichigo lunged before Zaraki could compose himself. He didn't hit. He crossed the jagged crater, his sandals of woven rushes finding purchase on the powdered stone, and seized the white cloth, bloody and wrapped about the hilt of Zangetsu. Running, Zaraki rumbled, quickly getting back to his feet. The giant swung his heavy blade in a brutal horizontal arc, targeting right for Ichigo's spine. Ichigo did not look back. He did not look. He clung to the giant black cleaver and swung it behind him, catching the blow out of instinct alone. Clang! The blast shattered every remaining floorboard within a 30-foot radius. But this time Ichigo was not brought to his knees. The kinetic shockwave didn't travel up his arms. The pale blue reishi was packed into the edge of Zangetsu with an absolute hyper-compressed density, and it totally absorbed the giant's momentum. Ichigo stood up straight, still with his back turned to Zaraki and the huge black sword in his hand behind him. The chipped katana of Zaraki was locked against the black steel. The giant looked at the point of contact, a sudden, frantic thrill ignited in his chest. Heavier, Zaraki murmured, his voice thrumming with pure, unadulterated ecstasy. Ichigo shoved Zangetsu back violently, releasing the lock. He spun around and slashed the huge cleaver in a devastating two-handed sweep. He didn't shout. He didn't spill. He swung with the utter silence of a falling guillotine. In the flooded city of the inner mindscape, deep down, the wild crashing waves suddenly became a perfect glass like stillness. Naruto Uzumaki climbed to his feet slowly. The heavy iron chains rusted and clanked across his shoulders in the quiet. The void's crippled god felt the monumental shift in the physical vessel. Ichigo finally stopped trying to match the sheer volume of the enemy's tempest. He worked the quiet. He was taking the crushing weight of the immutable present and forging it into the steel. Yes, agreed Naruto's inner voice, a deep and ancient thrum of approval that vibrated in the boy's bones. Naruto turned towards the west. The wild hollow was frozen solid, caught in a pale blue ice, its frantic red light trapped by the sheer, suffocating gravity of the void. Don't swing to push him away, Ichigo. Naruto sent the heavy conceptual command upward. Swing to fill the gap. Make the edge single. Let the giant tumble into the dark. The great black blade sliced the air at the night. Zaraki didn't even try to block. The captain of the 11th Division went directly to the path of the huge cleaver, fully confident that his iron-forged skin would break the boy's weapon like before. Zangetsu's silver edge hit the center of Zaraki's bare chest. It did not come back. There was no hammer on anvil. The hyper-compressed, noiseless reishi packed into the razor-thin edge acted as a microscopic wedge, violently cleaving the thick, blood-soaked cord that shielded the giant's body. Squelch. In the silent courtyard, the cracking sound of tearing flesh echoed. Zaraki grunted, his eyes widening in surprise. The kinetic force of the silent blow sent the huge captain backwards, off his feet. He skidded across the shattered paving stones. His heavy boots dug deep trenches in the dirt to halt his progress. He stopped about a dozen yards away. The courtyard was silent. The corridor was shattered and the wind whistled softly through it. Zaraki stood still, with his head bowed down. His silver bells and his hair were still. He lifted his left hand slowly, the thick, calloused fingers pressing against his chest. He drew his hand away and held it up in the moonlight. His fingertips were warm and dark crimson. Someone had carved a long, diagonal slash across his chest. Not a killing wound, but the skin was broken, 100%, no doubt about it. Blood poured from the cut, running down his scarred torso, soaking into the black fabric of his torn shiakusho. Far away, Yachiru sat on the stone railing and gasped, her pink eyes widening. Ichigo was in the center of the crater, panting from the exertion, his left hand bleeding freely against the white stone. He clutched Zangetsu hard, the silver edge of the heavy black cleaver glowing with a terrifyingly restrained pale blue light. I told you, Ichigo rasped, the heavy emptiness in his chest humming low, steady warning. I won't play anymore. Zaraki looked at the blood on his hand for a long, heavy moment. The swinging. A low, guttural sound throbbed in Zaraki's chest, rising quickly until it exploded into a deafening, sky-shattering roar of pure, panic laughter. Ha 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 ha. The sound was horrible. This was not the laugh of a man enjoying a joke, but the roar of a starving predator finding a meal worthy of its teeth, ecstatic in its euphoria. Zaraki threw his head back, bells ringing madly as his howling, golden spiritual pressure burst forth violently. The sheer concentration of his reishi took the form of a huge, glowing golden skull that hovered above the giant's body and bathed the dark chasm in light. You cut me, roared Zaraki, his one eye alight with demonic, bloodthirsty joy. Ignoring the pain completely, he drove the flat of his chipped katana against his own forehead. You really cut me. I haven't felt my own blood in years. The crushing gravity in the courtyard increased tenfold. Nearby, Hanataro whimpered, still pinned to the floor, the pressure threatening to break his ribs. Zaraki dropped his blade, the jagged, rusted tip directly at Ichigo. The giant shivered, muscles taut with the raw anticipation of the violence to come. Zaraki roared, taking a huge step, an earth-shattering step forward. Don't you dare die on me now, Kurosaki. And now we're just warming up. If you can cut my skin, then you can cut my bones. Ichigo didn't retreat. The pain in his ribs and the bleeding in his left hand were nothing compared to the absolute necessity of the moment. He couldn't get around the monster. He had to go straight ahead. He grabbed Zangetsu, slinging the heavy black steel over his right shoulder. He drew a deep breath of the cold air, filling the quiet emptiness in his chest with the utter absence of fear. Come on then, Ichigo said, his brown eyes locking with the golden skull. Let's see who blinks first. Thank you for taking the time